In today's video, I am going to be breaking down the Set Championships metagame. I have over 20 decks to share with you, covering every single ink color combination, and a ton of work has gone into this one, so give the video a like. If you'd like to support me even further, you can check out my Metafy page, which is similar to Patreon. I offer one-to-one coaching, as well as a big perk of being a supporter on Metafy is one-to-one contact with me about deck building, about gameplay. If you've got any questions about Disney Lorcana and you want my help, hit me up on Metafy. It's the best place to support the channel and get some extra cool perks. A big shout out, as usual, to the channel sponsor, which is Card Market. It's a great place to buy singles online in Europe. Now, what are the prizes on offer for the Set Championships? Well, it's this Hero Hamada. You can see actually a little bit of a change with the Set Championships, because you are going to be getting a Hero Hamada promo card for just participating. That is going to be the one on the right. That is a non-foil version of the card with the traditional border, or an unenchanted really, but it has that unique artwork. Now, Hero Hamada, the enchanted, will be for the top 8 players, and there is a playmat, although the playmat will say champion across it, and a change for this set is that it is only going to be the player winning the Set Championships that gets that playmat. So it's more important than ever to have a really good deck going into Set Championships, and we're going to talk about exactly what you need to be able to do to take down a Set Championships. I think one thing that's really important to remember is that Set Championships are there to have fun, and if there's a deck that you really like playing, I think that every single one of these decks I'm sharing in today's video has the potential to win a Set Championships. Maybe with the exception of Amber Sapphire, but honestly, you could probably pull it off in the right tournament meta. And every local game store will have a different meta. This is not a digital card game where there's just a worldwide meta where you're just going to queue and play against someone random around the world. No, this is a physical card game, of course, which means that there's going to be different meta games at your local game store, depending on where you are. Now, you can use that to your advantage. If you know that many of the best players at your local game store love to play Ruby Sapphire, it might be wise to play a deck which is good against Ruby Sapphire. And one thing I'm going to try and do for you in today's video is really break down the strengths and weaknesses of all of these decks. So for example, if you know that someone at your local game store plays a bunch of Ruby Steel and they're really good, we might be able to talk about ways that you could try and beat that deck. So without any further ado, what are going to be the most popular decks? Not necessarily the best, but the most popular. And I also think we probably need to change the tiers, because I think we've got ourselves an incredibly balanced meta. I don't think we've got an S tier deck. I think there's a bunch of really, really strong decks. But what are going to be the most popular? Well, Ruby Sapphire, I think, is a deck which you're going to need to be prepared for coming into this tournament. I have historically been someone that underestimates how powerful Ruby Sapphire is. But Ruby Sapphire functions best in a meta which doesn't anticipate it. It's a very greedy deck. It likes to do its own thing. You can't really tech too much for other decks. And you kind of have to, with Ruby Sapphire, hope that the meta is going to be kind for you. So my biggest recommendation would be to you that play a deck which has enough tech cards to deal with Ruby Sapphire. You need to be either quite quick, you need to be able to discard your opponent's cards, or you need to be able to bounce back the Maui Half Shark or remove it. Let's take a look at what the most popular Ruby Sapphire decks look like. It is the strongest deck in the game in a vacuum, I would say. The problem is with Ruby Sapphire, it has a lot of weaknesses, and whenever I play a deck, the first thing I usually like to do is make sure that the deck I play can beat Ruby Sapphire, because it's incredibly popular. A lot of players that are pretty good at the game like to play Ruby Sapphire because it's got that very powerful inherent, well, synergy in a vacuum, right? But again, you can definitely exploit the weaknesses. And this deck, a big weakness of it is if you miss Tipo or Sail on 2, then it definitely is going to be weaker. So if you're playing Ruby Sapphire, I strongly recommend that you mulligan a full 7 cards if you don't have that Tipo and you don't have the Sail. The other thing that's a big weakness about this deck is the lack of card draw. Without Hiram Flavasham, this deck can be really bad against discard decks because you're very much reliant on that Maui Half Shark to refill your hand. So cards like We Don't Talk About Bruno and Then Along Came Zeus are going to be common fixtures in this video because they're very good at dealing with the Half Shark. Of course, the McDuck Mana is a key piece to this deck as well, where this deck has gone from a pure control deck to like a little bit more on the aggro side. You've got a lot of cards which can gain you lore like a Pirate's Life and keep your opponent at bay. And a Pirate's Life is a huge card in this deck because it means that the aggressive strategies need to be really aggressive in order to win. Because if you can't remove the Half Shark, your opponent gets down a Half Shark and they can start chaining Pirate's Lives together, you are going to be in trouble. And trust me, I found it firsthand when I played against a pro player, Zan Syed. I just couldn't remove his Half Shark, and despite having a pretty aggressive deck, I couldn't even get close to 20. So Ruby Sapphire is absolutely a great pick for any player. I personally wouldn't play it, but there's probably no surprises there. I definitely have some personal biases against this deck. But my biggest recommendation to you would be that if you're playing a deck this set championships, make sure you know this matchup. Make sure you're comfortable being able to beat Ruby Sapphire. Now, Ruby Sapphire is a lot better when going first usually, but if you can get a deck which is beating Ruby Sapphire going second, I think you're going to be putting yourself into a really strong position to win your set championships. And I think if you play a deck which can't beat Ruby Sapphire, I don't think you're likely to secure yourself that playmat. So that's something to bear in mind. Ruby Sapphire, great deck. I'm going to put it in the A tier. There's going to be a lot of decks in the A tier. But what will be the other most popular decks? Amber Steel is going to be incredibly popular. There's a lot of different ways you can go about building Amber Steel. This list here is by Kurt Spessie, who is a Disney Lorcana pro player. I actually lost to them recently in a big tournament, and I've picked their list. There's a lot of different things you can do with Amber Steel. I've also got a non-aerial version, which I'll be sharing with you as well, which you can have a little look at here. There's two different ways of playing Amber Steel. You've got this version with Dock, which is affectionately known in the community as Diggy Hole. But my recommendation for you guys would be this more traditional take on Amber Steel with the aerial. This deck can have a little bit of a tricky matchup into Ruby Sapphire, but it has very, very good matchups elsewhere. And we did see Kurt just about able to take down DKP with Ruby Sapphire in the tournament, but they did lose to Zan Syed. So if your metagame is filled with Ruby Sapphire, this deck is probably not the best pick. But if your metagame is not filled with Ruby Sapphire, you really can't go wrong with this. There's a bunch of different ways you can build the deck. Miss Bianca is a new card which you might want to take a look at, which is a 6 cost, which costs just 4 if you have allies. I personally really like the Queen. Of course, Rapunzel makes this one a pretty expensive deck. If you don't have Rapunzel, you probably are not going to want to play this. But if you're used to playing Amber Steel, I think Amber Steel is, honestly, I think it might be a contender for best deck in the game. I think it's really, really strong. I would recommend Amber Steel over Ruby Sapphire, personally. But again, it really depends on your local metagame and just playing what you're comfortable with. But what are going to be the other most popular decks? Well, the next set of decks are going to be the Amethyst decks, and there's a ton of them. Amber Amethyst won't be too popular, but all of these decks end up playing quite similar. Amber Amethyst, I imagine you're going to see hardly any of, but you can just see that an Amethyst deck here, you don't really need that many cards from a different color combination to make it work. So for this list, I've got Rapunzel in there. I've got Pascal, Daisy, Piglet, and Lantern. I think this deck's pretty strong. Don't expect you're going to see a bunch of it. It's probably one of the weaker Amethyst decks, but I still think this deck is well good enough to win a set champs without a shadow of a doubt. It is very, very strong. I just don't think you're going to see it as much. I think any Amethyst deck can't be below the B tier. Like I say, you can just play so many cards in an Amethyst deck. Amethyst Emerald is a little bit of a weird one. This is Artabax's list, who's very well known for this. He's actually been moving away from Amethyst Emerald. Now, I had a bit of a hunch that Amethyst Emerald might be one of the best decks in the format, because I think it's going to have a very good matchup into Ruby Sapphire. But one thing this deck can struggle with a little bit is getting board control. And I think even though you've got these 4 copies of Ursa the Deceiver, the matchup into Amber Steel isn't that convincing. And I think that Amethyst Emerald, I'm yet to see a list I'm convinced by with this deck. I personally really like Prince John in these decks. The problem if you go down the Prince John route is, again, you might struggle with board control. I think Diablo is an interesting option in these decks as well. But Amethyst Emerald, even if Artabax isn't even playing it at a big tournament, he opted for Ruby Amethyst. I think that's a little bit of a damning reflection of this deck, so it's not necessarily one I would recommend. I think you absolutely can, by the way. I think that you can, if you can build the perfect Amethyst Emerald deck, I still think it could be one of the best decks in the format. You can't go wrong with Amethyst. But if Artabax isn't even playing it, it's probably not a great sign. So the other Amethyst decks, Ruby Amethyst, Amethyst Sapphire, and Amethyst Steel, are the three that I would recommend the most. And all three of these decks are going to be in the A tier. And I've actually got 3 different decks for you with Amethyst Steel. So let's start there. So we'll start off with the most traditional, the most simple, and this is just a mid-range version of the deck. Amethyst Steel is the king of mid-range historically. What is a mid-range deck? Some of you might be asking. Well, in card games, you've got 2 main styles of decks. You've got a aggro deck, which plays very quickly. You've got a control deck, which is incredibly greedy, has a slow start, but dominates the late game. And a mid-range deck just defines any kind of deck which sits somewhere in between. And this deck is exactly that. It has a little bit of questing power. It's got a little bit of control. The weakness of Amethyst Steel is that it doesn't have inherently as much power in a vacuum as the decks you're going to be playing against. But what it has in its favor is it just has a wide range of really good cards, and you can build your deck to suit the meta. And as many of my regular viewers know, I have a long storied history with Amethyst Steel, and this is the way I would play it this set. I would opt for a build with rabbits, and then along came Zeus. Why is that, you might ask? Well, you don't really, in this meta, you can't really afford to go too aggro with Maleficence, because even though that's going to give you a good matchup into Ruby Sapphire, it's going to mean you really struggle against Amber Steel and the other Amethyst decks. Whereas this build with the Zeus to deal with the Maui Half Shark, as well as a bunch of other control tools, should give you a really good meta coverage. There's definitely some flexible slots in this one. The Maleficents, the Calhouns, the Queen's Castles could be libraries. You could play more copies of Friends. You could play less Crabs. But overall, a really, really very strong deck. And I think you really can't go wrong with Amethyst Steel midrange. What I will definitely say is that if you're not that comfortable with this deck, I would not recommend it, because again, this deck in a vacuum isn't necessarily as powerful as the deck your opponent's going to be playing, but it just gives you a lot of opportunities to outplay them. That's why I really like Amethyst Steel. I just feel like I go into every game with the opportunity to outplay my opponent, and I back myself. But if you're, not too confident with the Amethyst decks, this is definitely not one I would recommend. But what are the other 2 Amethyst Steel decks I have for you? Well, this is a budget player's best friend. This is my Burn Baby Burn story deck. The word story deck comes from the Disney Lorcana story star, which is like that little lore node you've got there. And the idea of this one is it's a deck which can win without ever questing. Of course, you will quest with cards like Maleficent, but you have Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, Giant Cobra, which will gain you a ton of lore all at once. I actually think that the screenshot here, I would probably get rid of the Fire the Cannons and just play a 4th copy of Doc. That would be the one change, and that change will be reflected in the description. This deck is a deck I was playing really in the Bell Sapphire Steel meta, because this had a reasonably good matchup into it as an aggro deck, but this deck is absolutely tremendous still. If you like very aggressive decks, I cannot recommend this one enough. It's very, very strong. You have the Amethyst Chromacon to draw a ton of cards, and then, for example, if you're at 6 ink, you can play Pete and a bunch of 1-drops, and there's not really a lot many players can do about it. It does have a pretty bad matchup into Amber Steel songs though, so I would personally recommend the mid-range deck in this current metagame as a result. But there's one more deck we have, and this one is a tournament-winning deck from the weekend by Zan Syed, who was playing Jafar. Zan Syed, an incredibly good player, so even though they won the tournament, worth keeping that in, like a bit of a pinch of salt with that, because Zan is a very, very good player, but very, very fascinating build with Jafar. I think Jafar's quite well positioned. it tends to have pretty good matchups against Amethyst decks. Also, like against Ruby Sapphire right now, I can imagine it's better than it was previously. And Amber Steel is one of the trickier matchups historically for Jafar, because they also have a whole new world and they play lots of Zeuses and things like that. Not personally convinced about this. Zan said that it, had broken the meta or whatever, but yeah, Zan is a little bit like me and sometimes might be a bit hyperbolic with the titles, but there's nothing wrong with that. If you're a content creator, that's what you got to do. Don't hate the player, hate the game, right? So I just wanted to say that I think that this is a good deck, but I don't think it's anything revolutionary. I don't like this deck doesn't play Elsa, actually. I like the build quite a bit. I've played a lot of Jafar, but I think Genie with the lamp is very, very strong. But I really like Elsa in this deck. Being able to sing a whole new world with Elsa, I think, is really good. So that would be my personal addition to this one. But yeah, definitely a strong deck nonetheless, and a very, very fun one to play if you're looking for something a little bit different. But yeah, overall, I would recommend the mid-range build of the Amethyst Steel deck. Queen's Castle in this one over the library, because I just think you want that extra bit of questing power. I think Queen's Castle is very, very slept on in some of these more mid-range Amethyst decks, which want to be questing quite a lot. Now, the final one, we've got two more Amethyst decks to look at. We've still got, by the way, I'm going to put Amethyst Steel here. We've got Sapphire Amethyst and we've got Ruby and Amethyst, and these are two decks which I thought would be better. Well, let's look at the Ruby Amethyst list first. This is one I threw together. There's definitely different ways you can play Ruby Amethyst. I've gone for the library over the Queen's Castle in this one because of B prep. I like my 1-drops. I think Lumiere is a nice addition to these decks because it turns your Peter Pan Shadow Finder into a 3-strength character. Suddenly your Diablo can take some favourable trades which your opponent might not be expecting, and it gives you some really good protection from Sisu. Also, your Genie is suddenly a 3-4. Your Elsa can rush in at 3. And a big bit of synergy in this one is the Peter Pan Shadow Finder and the Maui Half Shark. So there's also quite a wide range of different actions for the Maui Half Shark synergy. I think that you could definitely look at playing 1 or 2 copies of Finders Keepers in here as well, which is that 5-cost action which draws you 5. Bee King Undisputed, a card that I've not seen anybody else playing in these builds, but I think it's very, very strong with the Half Shark. You could also look at playing Dragonfire. Overall, I think Ruby Amethyst is very well positioned. You can play your version of it. Like, you don't need the Half Shark builds if you don't own the Half Sharks. You can just play something more traditional. I think Ruby Amethyst is pretty well positioned. My biggest recommendation would probably be just to make sure you play all of those 1-drops, because I think that there's going to be a lot of aggro decks at the set champs coming up. And I think that if you miss a turn 1, you can be in a lot of trouble with this deck. So I personally don't think it's worth the risk. I think Ruby Amethyst is reasonably well positioned, but I think that the set champs are likely to have a pretty big aggro representation, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a bit. While I have it in the A tier, I would personally be playing Amethyst Steel and Amethyst Sapphire over this. And obviously you can do some searching and find a bunch of other Ruby Amethyst builds. I'm covering a bunch on my channel if you want to look at previous tournament results. There's lots of different ways you can build that Ruby Amethyst deck. Finally, we've got Blurpool, and I was pretty convinced right from the start, post the Hiram ban, I put Blurpool way above Ruby Sapphire, and someone was roasting me in my comments for that. Yeah, Blurpool looks really good. Now, I have to say, I am very unconvinced at the concept here of not playing any 1-cost characters apart from this Bell 3-cost, because of course you can get her down on turn 1. But there we are. This is a deck I haven't really had an opportunity to practice with too much, and JDRR is a very well-respected deck builder in the community. Blurpool's having a bunch of very, very good results. This is a very top-heavy build. I personally would be wanting... I don't like the library. I think you should play Queen's Castle in this deck. I think Queen's Castle is really good. The library, when you have no B preps, when you have none of these 1-cost characters which are cantrips, makes no sense, to be honest. I think you should play Scrooge McDuck's Manor or the Queen's Castle. And this one's very, very top-heavy build. But yeah, I know people have been having really good results with Blurpool. I haven't been able to test it myself too much, so I just wanted to take a deck from a very well-respected deck builder. You can't really go wrong with a build like this. I tend to have some pretty big deck building philosophical differences with JDRR, but we do like a lot of similar decks, and it's really cool to see that you can play these Amethyst decks in a bunch of different ways. But yeah, my recommendation for this one would be the Queen's Castle over the Library, and I would definitely consider trying to squeeze in a few more 1-drops personally. But if you want this top-heavy version, then this is a nice way of doing it. So overall, I think the Amethyst decks are really well positioned. I'd probably say I might give I think Amethyst Steel still the one for me. I would probably put it something like this. All of these decks are really, really solid. But what other styles of decks are you going to see at your local metagame? Well, I think it's time we talk about the Chernabog aggro deck, which I was alluding to earlier, because this deck won a massive tournament at the weekend, and this is the exact list. I did an interview with Joel, the winner, if you'd like to go and see that. And this deck is really well positioned. It was able to beat Amber Steel a bunch. It's got good matchups into the slower Amethyst decks. Probably it might struggle a little bit against Amethyst Steel, I would imagine. It struggles against Discard, but it's just got some very, very good matchups. It's going to completely destroy Ruby Sapphire, which is always nice. And yeah, it's just an incredibly explosive deck with big high roll potential. If you want to find out more about this deck, I did a whole video with the winner earlier this week. So we'll leave it there, but I'm going to put it straight up into the A tier. Maybe even here based off its... I'll probably put it here. But there's also another version of Amber and Emerald, which I wanted to draw your attention to because I think it's also very good. And this one is a list by Bennett, who finished at the top 64 of this tournament. And it is a more traditional take on Amber and Emerald with discard. Diablo is a bit of a weird card at the moment because a lot of the Amethyst decks have clean answers to it. But in a similar way to how I said Ruby Sapphire does best in a format which doesn't anticipate it, Diablo is the same. And maybe, with Diablo not being as popular, hasn't had as many good results, people might start cutting their Diablo removal and you might have a good time. I think you can definitely catch your local metagame off guard with a random Diablo deck. If very few people play Diablo at your local game store, it could be a really good pick. I think this deck is very well positioned. Discard is great. You've got the Ursula and Bare Necessities, which is so many ways of disrupting Amber Steel songs, for example. You've got the Kida Under the Sea combo. There's nothing really changed about this deck for a lot of sets. But yeah, it's a very, very decent deck, particularly if you high roll. If I had to pick, I would probably prefer the aggro deck, but it really depends on your local meta, right? It really, really does. So I think both of these are great options, and honestly I would probably put both into the A tier based off this weekend, but the Chernadog, having won the big tournament, gets the nod. Now there are 3 other discard decks which we're going to look at, one of which is Ruby Emerald, which is going to be far less popular. So let's look at the most popular discard deck that we have left, because again, these Amethyst Emerald decks can also be built in a discard route, and that is going to be Emerald Steel. And Emerald Steel has not exactly had very good results recently, but again, in a similar way to what I was just saying before, if your opponents at your local game store aren't expecting Diablo, you can really take advantage of that. I've put 3 Hidden Coves in. I've put Morph in there as well to try and consistently shift the Diablo. You might want to try and add in a couple more songs. These lists get very tight very, very quickly, but yeah, it's really... With this deck, you want to just try and high roll. You want to try and get the Diablo in the Hidden Cove. Play a Pete to protect it. So you can also shift Diablo onto Morph. You can shift Beast onto Morph as well. Yeah, I think that Emerald Steel, you can't really go too wrong with. I think in the wider metagame, Emerald Steel probably finds itself sitting here. But I think for set champs, it's probably a pretty good pick. I think it's probably a pretty good pick because a lot of people are going to get caught off guard by it. If people don't have techs for Diablo, you can absolutely steamroll them. It's a deck which suffers from its success a bit because in a similar way to Ruby Sapphire, lots of people will be teching for it. So I personally think in the wider metagame, it's probably here, but I think as a pick for set champs, I think that a lot of Emerald Steel players will win their set champs. I really, really do. So I think you can't go too wrong with it. And the final discard deck is going to be my personal favourite, my pet deck. So incoming bias, Bend to My Cow. Someone in my comments yesterday said, bend it like Spessie. That's a pretty good name. So this is the Bend It Like Spessie deck. Very, very difficult to play. If you haven't played this one before, I would definitely recommend some practice before you set champs. You can watch all my streams, and yeah, definitely if you want some coaching on this one, hit me up on Metafight, or just some personalized support with mulligans and things like that. Metafight is a great place to do it, as I mentioned previously. And this deck's very, very good. It's very difficult to play. I'm happy with the build. It does have a pretty tricky matchup into Amber Steel, but it has great matchups elsewhere. This deck just hasn't had any results to justify putting it anywhere above the B tier. Do I personally think it's an A tier deck? Probably, but I'm going to put it in the B tier because it hasn't really got the results. But it's very, very good. And I've got like 300 plus games of this deck over the past couple sets. I think it's really well positioned. Hiram Flavisham was a pretty big nuisance for this deck, but it's got great matchups into all of the Amethyst decks. It's got a great matchup into Ruby Sapphire, but it does have a glaring weakness in the form of Emerald can be a problem because the Ursula 2 causes it a lot of problems. It has consistency issues where if you miss ramp, you can be in trouble. It has a bad matchup into Pete, in particular Amber Steel. So overall, it's just got quite a few bad matchups. But I think it's very, very good. But you also need to be very, very good to play it, I think. Or you need to be very good with the deck. You need to be comfortable. Like one mistake in the early game and your deck's going to fall to pieces. And next, we've got the final discard deck, and that's Ruby Emerald. Not one I would recommend, but I think it's definitely an underrated deck. I just think there's better options, really, for a discard deck. And this one is very traditional to what I've played previously. You might notice I'm playing 3 Robin Hood Sharpshooters, which might surprise some of you. You could definitely play a 4th. But this deck is very, very similar to what I've played previously. I have a playset of the Robin Hood Enchanted. You could definitely play the 4th Robin Hood Enchanted. Robin Hood Sharpshooter doesn't need to be enchanted. This deck is a little bit bad. It's kind of good. Like, if you can get rolling, it really pops off. You just don't have much board presence, really. That's a big problem. The Cricky might be able to help. The discard stuff is very, very strong. I do like the deck a lot. I'm excited to try and play some again in the future. But it's not one I would personally recommend. I think it's going to be not terrible because I think it's got a lot of discard synergy. You're very reliant on Prince John for card draw. I think it can pop off. But I wouldn't recommend it. I'm going to put Ruby Emerald into the D tier. At the moment, the C tier is looking a bit bare. So we could do that. I don't know. I think Amethyst is very, very solid. I really, really do. Maybe I'll do that. I think that's fair. All right. Up next, because we haven't got many decks left, let's look at Sapphire Steel, which is probably the best deck that we have remaining. And it did recently take down the Content Creator Set Championships with my friend Harlan Sweet winning it. Oh, I can't find the Sapphire Steel deck, which is not ideal. It's around here somewhere. I'm trying to do this. There it is, with no editing, because I'm lazy. So Harlan won the Content Creator Set Champs with this one. This list actually might be slightly different from the Content Creator Set Champs win, but then he played and got top 64 at the big Ravensburg event last week, and that was more recent. So this is his most recent list. One thing I'm a bit surprised about in this deck is that he's not playing the Mulan 1 cost, which is a 2-1. You play it, draw a card, discard a card. I feel like that card's very good. So I would personally be playing that. Wendy Darling's in there. The Alice is in there. You've got a lot of aggro tools. I think the deck's definitely very, very solid. And I think you can't really go too wrong with this deck. I'm also interested in seeing if you could still play Porpsicles and Bells in this one as well. But Harlan is a loyal Sapphire Steel player, and they know what they're doing. They've got some really good results of it. Again, I think that Mulan 1 cost is pretty interesting to me with the Doc deck. I think it could be good. So that would be my recommendation. But hey, there's 4 Gantus, so I'm going to be happy. But Alice, Gantu, like this quicker curve, definitely seems to be the way to go for Sapphire Steel. It's a good deck. I don't think it's extraordinary. I would probably put it in the C tier. But it's good. It's definitely good. All of these decks are good, apart from maybe Ruby Emerald, but even Ruby Emerald's not bad. Now we have our final 3 sad old decks, the most unorthodox color combinations in Disney Lorcana, but one of them I think has more potential than the others. And surprise, it's not Mufasa. That's Ruby Steel. Ruby Steel got Mushu this set, which is one of the best cards in Disney Lorcana, which might sound like a little bit of a bold statement, but it is absolutely incredible. If this was not a dual link card in a bad color combination, it would be all over the place. And with the nerfs to Sapphire Steel, we had the Bell being rampant. This deck was just not really able to compete with that Sapphire Steel deck. You would just kind of lose on the spot, and you couldn't build the deck in a way which would be able to beat Ruby and Sapphire and have good matchups elsewhere. But now I think you can. I think this deck has some legs. Beast and Doc are your only card draw, which is a downside, but you've got the Seven Dwarfs Mine with the Happy, you've got the Mulan and the potential Mulan Shift. You might want to play more of those because that can be a lot of fun. You've got Gantu and Super Goof and Flynn for some big questing power to give you a good matchup into Ruby Sapphire, because like I said earlier in the video, that is always important. I think Ruby Steel might have some potential. I think it actually might be a solid mid-range deck. Like if I look at this deck and I look at Sapphire Steel, I have to say, I think this one looks better. I really do. I really do think this one looks better. You've got a little bit more control. You've got a little bit more speed. I think they're pretty similar decks. And I don't know. You might also want more Calhouns, more Jafars. I think Ruby Steel might be pretty decent. I'm going to put Ruby Steel into the D tier, but I think it's one to keep an eye on. Finally, we've got our last two decks, the historically worst color combinations in Disney Lorcana. Well, Ruby Steel and Ruby Emerald might also have something to say about that, but I'm hoping we get some dual ink cards to support these two. The Puppies and the Racers just didn't do anything to push these bad cards, these bad ink colors, whereas like the Mushu did a lot for Ruby Steel. So I'm definitely keeping my eye on Reign of Jafar reveals to see if we get any cool dual ink cards. Let's start off with I can't find any of them. My OBS is a mess. Let's start off with Amber Sapphire because it's the first one I found. I just went for aggro mode. It could be worse. It's cheap. You also could play Rapunzel if you have access to it, but I figured that if you're looking to play Amber Sapphire, you might want to do it on a budget, and I'm not sure Rapunzel's that good anyway. This deck is just looking to be aggressive. You've got lots of characters with Ward. You've got Mufasa. I put Kida in there as well to fit the aggro game plan because the wand costs are pretty bad. Pluto you definitely don't necessarily need to play, but I wanted to highlight a really cool combo, which is Pluto on turn 1. You tap the Pluto and you can play Pleakley on turn 2, which gives you a big body and ramps you up. This Bell 4 cost is also fascinating, being able to give you a whole board Ward, I think is quite underrated. And yeah, I think this deck is like not terrible, but not good either. I think there's better aggro decks. You could probably build a better Amethyst aggro deck, for example. You could probably build a better Amethyst Steel aggro deck, but it's probably not terrible. Is it good enough to win a set champs? Probably. Why not? I think you could do it in the right meta, but it's probably the one I would recommend the least, if I'm honest. But finally, we have Ruby and Amber, or as I've called it historically, Mufasa. Yep, so the last deck, Ruby and Amber with Mufasa. It's a fun one. If you enjoy playing this deck, you can do it, but it's just not very good, unfortunately. It's got a lot of very bad matchups. Doesn't have many good matchups, in my opinion. You might have like a little bit of a chance against some Amethyst decks. You're going to probably struggle against Steel decks because they can disrupt your Mother Gothel and Rapunzel card draw. Overall, Mufasa is a fan favorite, but it is the worst deck, in my opinion. Like, at least with the Amber Sapphire, you can go full aggro mode. I just don't think there's any reason to play Ruby Amber. I'm sorry, Mufasa fans. I like Mufasa too, but it is not a deck I'd recommend playing. But you can absolutely have fun with it. You can definitely win a set champs. I think you can win a set champs of all of them. Maybe Ruby Amber probably should be above this, but I don't know. I think that hyper aggro is kind of underrated. I'm going to stick with my guns. Is there anything else I want to change now we've finished the video? Might put Emerald Steel back down there. I think like the discard decks all in B tier is kind of fair. Like probably the Emerald Amber discard deck would be in here as well. Like I think discard's definitely good, but I'm not really sure we've seen the perfect lists anywhere. Apart from maybe Emerald Sapphire. I back that list, but that's because I made it myself. Of course I do. Yeah, I don't know. Discard is like not doing as well as I thought it might, basically. It's quite interesting. Amber Steel is quite good against discard, and maybe that's the reason why. But yeah, overall we have a really very diverse meta. I think you can win a set champs with all of these decks. So even though I'm picking on Ruby, Amber and Amber Sapphire a bit at the end there, I think they've got some potential to do well. And I do hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks again to Card Market, who sponsored the video. If you're looking at picking up any singles in Europe ahead of set champs, Card Market is the place to do it. Give the video a like and don't forget to subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments what deck you're going to be playing at set champs, and don't forget to check out my Metafy page for some unique perks where I can give you some personalized Disney Lorcana deck building support and coaching. Cheers.